Hi, welcome to session 9. And in this session, we are focusing on data analysis approaches. In the previous sessions, we talked about if we remind ourselves, we looked at planning for evaluation, we looked at framing it, we looked at terms of references, inception reports, and forming the evaluation a group or team that would conduct the evaluation. And then we moved on to look at the approaches, methodological approaches that you can use to collect data. We also looked at methods for desk research, disk evaluation, where you look at secondary data, and then we also looked at the actual field methods. So it's a whole range of methods, and using such methods you can generate all kinds of information, whether qualitative or quantitative, and all that needs to be analyzed based on your, of course, evaluation questions. So in this session, we are mainly focusing on the idea that you've collected data, you have it now. So what do you do with it? Okay, so that's what we are looking at in this session. So we are focusing on analysis to answer the evaluation questions. So we look at the different categories of questions: qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis, and then of course moving from analyzed findings towards discussions and making conclusions and recommendations that result that are coming out of your analysis. So again, we remind ourselves evaluation of humanitarian action so that we know why it is all done. Okay, so again, systematic, impartial examination and objective examination of any humanitarian action or intervention. And the whole idea is that you want to draw lessons for purposes of learning to improve policy and practice, but also enhance accountability. So remember again, the two main purposes of evaluation: accountability and learning. Okay, so you have your data, you've collected it from the field. What do you do with it? So we have two categories of data. Remember, during our methods, we were collecting qualitative in terms of which is more subjective, so in terms of words, or quantitative in terms of statistics and numbers. Okay, and we also said that you can maybe do mixed methods where you generate both categories of data. Okay, so we have qualitative data and quantitative data, or you can do you have both kinds of data. And again, comparing desk research, which does secondary or primary, which does give you primary data from the field visits and so on, or you have data that is both and mixed. So in this case, analysis is needed, of course, to make those conclusions that would later on inform policies and practices. Yeah, so you have primary data, newly collected data. Again, you have secondary data, which has to do with the already collected data but can be useful for evaluation. Maybe the data was collected during monitoring and so on. But then you have evidence. In this case, evidence is a body of facts that supports certain proposition or proposition or belief that maybe you had made hypothesis before, and then you want to use that primary or secondary data to support whatever you're saying. Or if you're making a recommendation, where does it come from? Okay, so you must have evidence. Maybe the refugees said they did not receive quality food. So do you have evidence to support that? And that is generated from your primary data or secondary data. So you have data categories again and the mode of analysis. So you have quantitative data, which is usually statistics, and it is more of big numbers because you are working on representation. Okay, so the higher the percentage of your sample size, the more representation, depending of course on your total population from which your sample was drawn. Now go back to the previous session and then look at, of course, the different types of sampling, probabilistic sampling and non-probabilistic sampling. Okay, to see which one gives you big data or small data. So for big data, quantitative data, you usually do statistical analysis, and for qualitative data, which is usually small n in terms of sample, because we are not looking at, we are not more interested in the numbers in terms of representation, but in terms of details, meanings and interpretations. So you usually analyze using coding. You create themes and content that represent certain meanings. Okay, so for accuracy or reliability, for quantitative, you focus on, of course, applying particular methods. Maybe you want to do regression or correlation or whatever you want to do to be able to ascertain your findings. Okay, for quantitative, you can use the method itself or to use triangulation. Remember, we said triangulation could be in terms of methods, could be in terms of data sources, could be in terms of participants, and so on. And then you also have quality of data, which can be through triangulation that I just talked about. So how do we then focus on analyzing evaluation data based on evaluation questions? Okay, so we are going to look at evidence analysis to answer different particular questions. So in session 5, during framing evaluation, we looked at the different types of questions. Descriptive questions, which look at standards, normative questions that look at asking to the level of achievement in terms of standards, but then you also look at causal questions that look at the extent to which certain interventions influence certain outcomes, evaluative questions that look at whether indeed the intervention was worth it or not, and then you have the action-oriented questions that look at maybe you are evaluating to ask maybe, okay, how could we better have distributed maybe mosquito nets in a certain refugee camp? Okay, something like that. So you're looking at what works, what doesn't work, and how you can improve what doesn't work. Okay. So evidence analysis to answer normative questions, which are basically on standards. In this case, you triangulate evidence in terms of looking at whether maybe the operational managers or the implementers did comply with the state set standards. Maybe the UNICEF, maybe Red Cross standards has standards of how intervention should be done, or the overall humanitarian system, or certain country codes. Okay, so you have those maybe, yeah. So for instance, what kind of shelter were provided, or what kind of food quality was distributed, and you have to be more rigorous in terms of breaking down what kind of standards. So you separate those particular characteristics of standards, and then you evaluate based on those standards. So in that case, you'll be evaluating the extent of compliance or extent of breaching. If there is high breach, it means that maybe that indeed the intervention did not, the performance of intervention was not good. Okay, then you have questions. You have analysis that aims at answering questions of evaluative questions that look at the value judgment, whether, for instance, it was worth it to do the intervention or not. Was it worth to give cash transfers? Was it worth to distribute food? Was it worth to provide shelter in certain contexts or not? So in that case, you break down your questions, of course. Separate descriptive, normative for from purely evaluative, and then after you can do your rigorous and transparent kind of analysis. And in this case, you apply what we call evaluative reasoning. So in evaluative reasoning, you combine performance evidence on, for instance, a specific dimension of that would help you to test whether it was worth it, or interpret by value of goodness to generate particular ratings. For instance, how good was the food that you received? You are now asking a respondent, maybe, how good was the food that you received? Maybe on a certain scale. So you drop certain characteristics that define the level of goodness: bad, good, or not bad, or very good, and so on. Okay, so in that case, you are applying what we call evaluative reasoning. So you can also combine performance ratings on different dimensions to have overall conclusions on performance. Okay, so all these are categories of how you can evaluate whether for instance, the intervention was worth it or not. So again, by evaluating reasoning, you can also use what we call evaluative rubric. You can draw a table, but in this case, you don't have to put ratings. But in this case, you have elements of performance descriptors and criteria for defining what kind of goodness it is, as I've just said in the previous slide. So you have, for instance, so descriptors of a certain intervention, and what you want to ask the respondents in terms of whether a certain intervention or output or input or outcomes whether certain intervention inputs were actually good or not good, or very good or excellent, or whatever. So this is how you can do your evaluative analysis of evaluative to determine value judgment, or whether it was worth it or not. Then you have evidence analysis to answer descriptive questions, which in this case are linking intervention to outcomes, linking, for instance, inputs or your resources to the outcomes. Take an example. You maybe said, okay, refugees will be given farming inputs, or agricultural inputs. So you want to ask, okay, whether, for instance, the provision of agricultural inputs, maybe seedlings and so on, did actually contribute to improved product, did actually contribute to the level of production, or the entire kind of livelihood. Okay. Something like that. So you're looking at causality influence of many factors. So in this case, remember the aspects of contribution versus attribution. In evaluation of humanitarian action, it is difficult to focus on attribution because first of all, you have many different actors within the humanitarian system that are also contributing. So it is, but also you don't know what other factors might have influenced the outcome. So in this case, you concentrate on evaluating contribution rather than attribution. Unless if you are using the design of experimental, because experimental design, there you have you have a control group and experiment group, whereby you provide whatever you want to test to a certain group, and then in that case you can be able to ascertain that, okay, for this particular intervention, maybe okay, women groups who received a certain amount of money were able to invest it in income generating projects, and they have therefore improved on their income levels. Okay, in that case you can attribute, if you are using experimental design that, such as randomized control trials. Please visit again the previous session for that. Or if you are using quasi experimental, yeah, you can also test some kind of attribution, but not so much. So that is why you find that most of the evaluation, most of the designs used in evaluation of humanitarian action are non-experimental. Okay, so in this case, you're drawing, of course, causal inferences, establishing the relationship between causal effect, maybe whether the distribution of malaria has actually indeed reduced incidence of malaria cases in a certain refugee camp also. Okay. So there are various strategies. You can ask those with first-hand observations or experiences tell you how things have changed. You can eliminate alternative explanations and concentrate on distinctive patterns to only see those that are visible or observable, those that are observable outcomes vis-a-vis what you used for your inputs. You can check timings and happening of change, what happened before your intervention and then after intervention, what happened. You can use comparison if you are using quasi-experimental. You can use statistical models, especially for instance if you are using randomized control trials and so on. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of range of ways to determine causal effect relationships. Then there is also, of course, evidence to analyze causal questions on uptake and effects of services, analyzing coded quantitative data. So, for instance, you have themes, you generate sub-themes. You can do deductive themes from your secondary data, and then you go to the field and check, and then you analyze based on those deductive. But the best way is also to, if you are using primary data, you can use inductive, whereby the themes and meanings or coded themes are being generated from the actual data that you're analyzing. For statistics or quantitative data, you can use statistical methods to do descriptive results, summaries or averages in terms of frequencies or percentages, yeah, and so on. Then you have qualitative data analysis of secondary data. I've just been talking about it. This is related to what we talked about in terms of desk methods or secondary data in that case. So if you conduct desk reviews, you have different steps, okay? And you have different tools and ways of making summaries. You can also enter them into a certain evidence tool and then you analyze it. But you can also use what we call portfolios, whereby you have descriptive analysis on certain topics, 8 percentages, maybe how did the funding from the Norwegian Council, Refugee Council, enter through your systems? Was it through maybe private organizations or non-governmental organizations? Then where did it go and how much was allocated to certain NGOs in a certain zone or something like that? Okay, establishing intervention rating tools. For instance, you rate each project in the portfolio against the ratings, therefore coming up with evidence on how certain projects performed in a certain area. Then you have, for qualitative data analysis of primary data, you use rigorous and logical processes. Of course, by logic, we are not talking about logic in terms of statistics, but you are using certain coding methods to to match findings with certain information based on what you want to find out. Okay, so assessing categories to specific evidence and then drawing evidence pieces together so that you can have evidence that supports a certain coded information. Okay, maybe yeah, it was on quality of the food that was distributed. Maybe it was on quantity. Maybe it was on equality, or yeah, how who received or who did not receive the food. Okay, so coding, you read notes and attach codes, generate themes, and then you add labels or comments or highlights or depending on what you want to specifically focus on in terms of your analysis, and again later on what you want to be able to inform certain conclusions and recommendations. So can be done manually or electronically. You have all sorts of softwares that can help you to analyze qualitative data, such as NVivo and so on, Hyper Research and so on. For secondary data, so you have, for quantitative data, which is the big N, remember, so you can use a statistical analysis in terms of course there are all types of different types of data that is collected. One is categorical, which has to do with nominal. For instance, maybe you collected information on how many men received cash transfers and how many women received cash transfers, or okay. So but you also have, for instance, maybe ordinal. You have ordinal category, which which has to do with ranking and so on. So maybe a certain social class, maybe the highly educated or the less educated, did not receive the same did not receive the same intervention inputs or so. So from low to upper, maybe poor households with certain category of income were able to participate in certain intervention, so something like that. Then you have also numerical data, which has to do intervals, maybe scores, for instance, scores where there is no zero, so in terms of food security, in terms of income levels, and so on. You have ratios whereby there is a meaning for zero, okay, and meaning multiplication of numbers. So, for instance, weight gained with feeding intervention. Maybe you provided food distribution, and then you can now measure whether the children, after, following your continuous distribution of food, have been able to gain weight. Maybe before your intervention there were high levels of high cases of malnutrition and so on. Or you can look at enrollment and completion in education intervention. Maybe within a refugee setting, attainment of school was very low, so you establish a school and then improve enrollment, and then you want to test whether enrollment and completion rates have actually gone high after you've established that school in a certain refugee camp. So for data analysis, while for qualitative you are doing coding and generating themes and so on, for statistical analysis you are doing cleaning and data entry. Okay, so of course it is easier when you have used electronic methods, because if you designed your online survey or something like that, or if you are entering data, collecting data using your phone or any other gadget in the system, then the application can be programmed to be able to sort and clean your data. Okay, but of course doesn't mean that it cannot have errors. Okay, they are still there. But then you also have issues of missing data, which can later on bias the results. Maybe these people did not respond, or those who responded, there were some kind of partial responses, and the reasons for that is that maybe they do not want to respond. Maybe you gave them many questions and they did not have time to respond. For instance, in cases where you want to collect data in situations where people trying to escape a certain condition. Take an example of the recent Afghanistan incident. Maybe you wanted to you want to collect data from those who are actually trying to flee the country, but then they are on a rush and then they don't have time, or people are traumatized. They do not want to go to be reminded of certain incidents and so on. Or they cannot be able to answer, or they do not know, or the emulator or research assistant skipped some questions. All those are reasons for missing data. But the good strategies to counter this is that you can have a good questionnaire that is designed, don't have too many questions, and the questions should be clear, not complicated, easily understood. You can also do pre-testing before so that you know the level of response. But also one counter is that you do oversampling. So, because if you do oversampling, it means that for those that would not answer, then you can be able to have what to replace them if they do not have enough data that you want. Okay. Then you have, of course, again, statistical analysis of primary data using statistics in evaluation of humanitarian action. Two types of statistics. You have descriptive statistics that do summarize key aspects, and then in this case you are doing measures of central tendencies, average, mode, mean, and average, and of course median. But you also you're measuring dispersion in terms of distribution. Okay. So in this case, you are using values of standard deviation or quantile deviation, or distribution or range and variance. Okay. So for instance, between those in the lower quantile, poor, versus those on top, poverty quantile, the rich versus the poor. And then the second category is that of statistics, you have inferential statistics, whereby using samples to make inferences about certain population. Okay, using hypothesis that maybe, okay, you're saying women who are from poor households and are less educated tend not to participate highly in certain maybe women empowerment projects. Okay, and then you can use that, you can use your evidence or statistics to make such inferences, if indeed your statistical data can help you to justify that. Okay, so e.g. consider numbers of refugees or displaced persons in an area over time, something like that. So you have also statistical hypothesis. I just talked about what a hypothesis is. So you have alternative hypothesis versus null hypothesis. In null hypothesis, you are actually looking at the counterfactual. For instance, what would have happened if we did not distribute cash if we did not implement the cash transfer project? What would have happened if women were not empowered to have certain skills? What would have happened if the project was not there to address incidents of GBV? What would have happened if we do not distribute food to counter the cases of malnutrition? So that is a null hypothesis. Okay. So in null hypothesis, you can state it, for instance, by saying, okay, there is no this and that. But for alternative, you say, okay, if we do this and this, then this is what happened. Okay. So so an example could be, okay, for alternative, there is increase in enrollment and completion where teachers uh, are more paid, okay, or there is a high completion rate where refugee children are supported in terms of tuition and in terms of provision of tuition. But null hypothesis would be, okay, there, for instance, there is no uh, uh, teachers are not motivated if they are not paid well, okay, so something like that. So you have to test the hypothesis, and hypothesis about characteristics of a single group using a sample, or hypothesis about differences between two groups. For instance, if you are using quantitative, quasi experimental, or for control group, or experimental, or control if you are using experimental um, design. So you can test corrosion also, maybe whether the hypothesis was true or false. So wrong corrosion, that hypothesis is false, equals false negative error. You can please refer back to session 7 to look at the aspects of sampling uh, in terms of determining percentage chances of certain errors. So you can also do statistical tests. For instance, so you can consult reliable literature to how to do those statistical tests. Of course, one thing that you should know is that statistical analysis is more technical compared to qualitative data analysis. So it depends on the data type, number of dependent and independent variables, or the evaluation design that you have, whether it is quantitative, quasi, or experimental, or non-experimental. And statistical tests also, of course, relate to there are different analysis. You can do multiple regressions, or interrupted time series, or discontinuous regression, and so on. The rule is that testing all out, you have, of course, to consider issues to do with testing all outcomes for statistical significance. Otherwise, if you miss some, then you have biased information, evidence that might not be reliable enough, or valid. There are many packages for testing, or doing qualitative analysis. You have statistical package for social sciences, which is SPSS. You have Stata, you have Microsoft Excel, and so on. So all these you can. I do hope that you can do all the practice in your qualitative or quantitative research methods class or module. So you have numerical analysis of secondary data, which is similar to what we've just talked about, but common statistical tests used in numerical analysis could include correlation, whereby you're checking the probability that certain correlation happened, maybe by chance or not. Then tests for independence, whereby you run your chi-square to look at whether two factors are related or depending on each other. So you've analyzed your qualitative data or quantitative data, or a mix of both, and then the question would be, then how do you now move from evidence that you have analyzed or you have to making recommendations? Okay, now evidence can be reported terms of, I mean, you have reported evidence, findings, conclusion, recommendations. And in this case, a finding is a factual statement based on evidence. But evidence is the body of facts that you would have to use to support a certain finding. And then you have, so for instance, you have a finding that shows that the food that was distributed was of poor quality. Evidence could be that actually the statements that are said in a certain quantitative data that that maybe the participants actually said it, and then you have verbatim quotes, or maybe you have a picture that looks at, if you are using pictorial picture voice methods, pictures that are showing the quality of food or not. Okay, so that's evidence. You're supporting your finding. The conclusion, you can say, okay, therefore, I mean, the project of food distribution did not perform up to the standard, of maybe World Food Program standards. Okay, so recommendation, you can then say maybe, yeah, there could be regular monitoring mechanisms to see that the procured quality of food before distribution can be tested. Okay, something like that. So that's how you match your findings, evidence, conclusion, and recommendation. So there is, of course, a way of how you can present your findings. So you have observation, you draw findings, and then you make conclusions, and then you recommend. Of course, but all these are based on the evidences that you have. So clear process of analysis, be transparent, and support your findings with evidence. The flow of evidence, findings, and conclusions should be logic enough for someone to be able, for policymakers, remember, it's for purpose of learning, but also to tracing. So it should be logic enough to show the stakeholders or the intended users of the evidence to be able to see how evidence matches with your conclusions and so on. Okay, so at the end of your report, you have your conclusion as your conclusion. Now, recommendations can be generated and reported by evaluation team, can be developed and refined through consultation with your stakeholders, but could be also omitted from the report, and the commission relies on conclusions to make their decisions for improvement or for whatever reasons they want to do. But of course, they can be useful if they are specific, practicable, directed, time-bound, consistent, prioritized, and so on. So consider appropriate number of recommendations. Too many, then you don't have you confuse the stakeholders, the users. Remember from the beginning, the whole evaluation is that at the end of the day, whatever results that are coming from evaluation, they must be useful and they must be used. But if you draw too many conclusions, you might confuse the users and they might abandon some kind of recommendations. So let your recommendations be specific to certain aspects based on certain research questions. Okay, it is very important. You could also maybe choose to say, okay, you give specific recommendations for specific audience. Okay, that is very important. So in the next session, of course, we are going to look at communicating and dissemination of your findings. Okay, so bottom line is that analysis depends on evaluation design, type of data, evaluation questions, and analytical approaches, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative analysis. And the findings must be supported by evidence, and conclusions should be based on findings. Should be clear, logic, scientific presentation of findings, conclusions, and recommendations in the evaluation report. So now we are assuming we have our evaluation report ready with conclusions, with findings, with recommendations. What do we do with the evaluation report? What do we do with the information that we have drawn in this evaluation report? In the next session, we look at communication and dissemination of your evaluation findings. Okay, these are some. This is a resource that you can look at for further details regarding analysis. Thank you.